China must realize it, first of all, because they've been dealing with this. But you think it's important that we have not been letting him save face with his own people with these very public pronouncements, very public attacks on Xi and democracy and everything else.
And I'll give you another example, which is when the United States got some intelligence that Xi Jinping was considering providing military support for the Russians. Clearly unacceptable for the U.S. What the U.S. could have done was made that very clear at the highest level, privately to the Chinese, share the intel, say, if this happens, here is what we will do. And not just us, but our allies. We've talked to them. Instead, what happened is public name and shame, US, NATO, UK, put the Chinese on notice the same way, the exact same way the US did with intelligence on Russia before they invaded in Ukraine on February 24th, a year ago. In other words, the American position is we're treating the Chinese the way we treat the pariahs, the Russians. And when Biden says democracies versus autocracies, same message. We're treating the Chinese the same way we treat the Russians. If you're China, that lack of respect, that lack of face, which is not aligned with Xi Jinping's personal relationship with Biden that goes back many years at this point, that's unacceptable. And that's precisely why Xi Jinping decided to make the unprecedented statements against the United States a week ago. Yeah. He's coming out of zero COVID. He feels like he's in a much stronger position. He's got his third term president for life all locked up. Chinese economy picking up again. It's not like he worries particularly about domestic approval at home. He's got an authoritarian regime, but he also sees a majority of the world's population is increasingly aligned with peace as opposed to the United States and Europe seen as more hypocritical from the perspective of the global South. So Xi Jinping is making a structural play here. And it's deeply problematic for the United States.
Well, I think that's what's interesting, the consequences. And we can shift to Europe, but I'm used to there being this parallel, the rhetoric being one level, but then the reality on the ground being very different. You're saying it's changed now. And even let's take globalization, a slight aside. There is this sense that the U.S. is not engaged in globalization anymore, yet it's hosting APEC this year. We've seen NATO become much stronger, as you've pointed out, during the Ukraine crisis. How well does it play in the U.S. to be talking about engaging globally, on a business level? It just seems like that's one of the issues in terms of how it's being translated to the common folk here.
Well, it's interesting. Because the United States is still by far the world's superpower from a national security perspective, outspending everybody and has the military leadership, and there is general support for U.S. policy on Russia-Ukraine, which is multilateral and aligned with the European allies. There's general support, strong support for U.S. policy on China that's aligning AUKUS. We've got, right now, Biden meeting with both the UK and the Australian leadership in San Diego. And we've also got the Quad and India's engaged. So from a national security perspective, it seems to work. But you're not asking about that. You're saying, well, wait a second. What about globalization? What about trade? What about market access? And it turns out that a lot of Americans say we haven't benefited from those trade deals. Like, a lot of people got rich and the global economy grew and maybe the US economy grew. But what about us? Why should we care about that? And there hasn't been a good argument for that. So whether it's Trump's America First or it's Biden's US foreign policy for the American middle class, market access is no longer a lever the Americans can use to talk about globalization. So instead, what you see the Americans doing on trade and the economy is say, well, let's take those areas of the economy that we can define as national security adjacent and get our allies on board on that. So friendshoring. Don't want to do anything in China. Let's do more
That's not a term
with the Mexicans, for example. Nearshoring, friendshoring, there's a lot of talk about that. You hear that from Secretary Raimundo. You see it from Gretchen Whitmer. But Republicans talking about it too. I was just in Mexico a couple of weeks ago, and all the CEOs, every single one, brings up nearshoring because they're saying, well, no, not going to be China. So in that regard, national security, it's going to be more here, right? You'll also see coordination on semiconductors with the Dutch, with the Japanese, with the South Koreans. You've got this CHIPS 4 agreement. You've got alignment with allies because national security defines the semiconductor issue more than just openness and free trade. So the Americans, everything's a hammer, looks like a nail. We've got a big national security hammer, so let's talk about more nails. And if you can't do a trans-Pacific partnership, which is what America's allies want the United States in, then at least you can talk about other aspects of the global economy that get some of these folks on board. But that's not globalization. Right?
No, it's
and
very
the
different.
corporations don't like that because it's not as efficient, it's not as global.
Yeah, and everything becomes political. Let me.
But one other thing I should mention,
No, please.
which is that let's also be clear that part of the reason that American firms are slowing down their Chinese investment is because they're concerned about US-driven risk with China. Part of it is because they're concerned about China's lack of transparency, the lack of rule of law, the fact that China's corporations are aligned with the government and they're a lot stronger than they used to be, the fact that China no longer has the labor cost advantages that they used to, and these companies don't need as much labor. So some of this nearshoring, some of this reversal of globalization would be coming even if you had the most articulate strategic US policy towards China imaginable, and we need to understand that too.